Close your eyes and imagine the year 1492. A fleet of 3 ships, led by a man named Christopher Columbus, sails across an ocean so vast, many believed it would never end. The Spanish crown had promised him riches, glory, and new lands. But what Columbus found was something far greater and far darker. When he set foot on the islands of the Caribbean, he met a people who were kind, generous, and peaceful. The Arawaks. They welcomed the strangers, offering food, water, and gifts. They had no weapons, no armies, no thought of conquest. To them, sharing was natural. To Columbus, it was opportunity. In his journal, he wrote that with 50 men, he could control the entire population and make them do whatever he wished. And so began a story not of discovery, but of domination. The Arawaks were enslaved, forced to search for gold that did not exist in the abundance Columbus had promised. Those who resisted were punished brutally. Families torn apart, cultures destroyed, lives lost. This is the untold beginning of America's story, not of heroes and glory, but of suffering and blood. Columbus did not discover a new world. He invaded one that already thrived, with millions of people, languages, and traditions. And with his arrival began centuries of conquest, exploitation, and resistance. This was not just the meeting of 2 worlds. It was the beginning of a struggle that would shape the very foundation of the United States. After Columbus, the tide of conquest could not be stopped. Ships continued to cross the Atlantic, carrying with them soldiers, settlers, and the hunger for land and wealth. Spain, France, England each sought to carve its own empire from the soil of a land that was already alive with people and history. In the early 1600s, the English established Jamestown, the first permanent colony. Life there was brutal. Hunger, disease, and conflict with native tribes brought death to many. But the dream of riches was stronger than the fear of death. Slowly, the colonies began to grow, fueled by tobacco fields and the promise of profit. Yet survival in this new world came at a terrible cost. Native peoples were pushed from their lands, villages burned, treaties broken. What began as trade and uneasy coexistence soon turned into wars of extermination. The soil of America was watered with blood long before it was planted with crops. And it was not just the native population who suffered. From Africa, enslaved men, women, and children were brought in chains to work the plantations. Stripped of freedom, stripped of identity, they became the backbone of a system built on exploitation. Alongside them, poor European laborers, known as indentured servants, were forced into years of grueling work under promises that were rarely fulfilled. This was the birth of colonial America, not a land of freedom and equality, but a land of hierarchy, control, and survival. For the wealthy few, opportunity flourished. For the many, it was a life of struggle, hardship, and resistance. The seeds of America were planted in conquest and inequality. And yet, within this harsh soil, the desire for liberty and justice began to grow, quietly, dangerously, inevitably. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had grown. 13 settlements stretched along the Atlantic coast, diverse, restless, and filled with tension. People worked the land, traded goods, and built towns, yet they remained under the shadow of the British Crown. Taxes were imposed from afar. Decisions were made in London, not in the streets of Boston or Philadelphia. The anger began to boil. When Britain demanded more, through taxes on tea, paper, and daily essentials, ordinary colonists saw it for what it was: control without representation. Voices of protest rose, first in whispers, then in shouts. Pamphlets circulated, meetings grew heated. And in taverns, churches, and marketplaces, the idea of freedom spread like fire. The spark came in 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. A few years later, rebels dumped crates of tea into the harbor, a defiant act against tyranny. The line had been drawn. The struggle for independence had begun. Farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, ordinary men and women, took up arms against the most powerful empire in the world. The American Revolution was not just a war of muskets and cannons. It was a war of ideals. The Declaration of Independence, penned in 1776, proclaimed words that would echo through history: that all men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But behind those words was contradiction. Freedom was promised, yet slavery continued. Liberty was declared, yet women and native peoples were excluded. The revolution was both a bold beginning and a flawed one. Still, against all odds, the colonies fought and endured. After years of bloodshed, sacrifice, and resilience, victory came. The British surrendered. A new nation was born. Not perfect, not just, but filled with possibility. The revolution gave birth to the idea of America, a place where freedom could exist, even as the struggle to truly define it had only just begun. The war was won, but victory brought new challenges. 13 colonies stood free, independent but divided. Each had its own laws, its own priorities, its own vision of the future. Without unity, this fragile experiment in freedom could collapse before it even began. Leaders gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, determined to shape a new foundation. Behind closed doors, debates raged. What kind of government should this nation have? How much power should belong to the people, and how much to the elite? The result was the Constitution, a document hailed as a masterpiece, but born from compromise. It created a system of checks and balances, dividing power between branches of government. It promised order and stability. But beneath its noble words lay silence on the deepest injustices. Slavery was not abolished, it was protected. Native lands were not safeguarded, they were threatened. Women's voices were absent from the table. The Constitution was not a charter for all. It was a framework designed by and for the powerful. Still, for many, it was a beginning. The Bill of Rights soon followed, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly, principles that would inspire generations to come. Yet even these rights were unevenly granted. To the poor, to the enslaved, to the silenced, justice remained out of reach. As the young nation grew, so too did its ambition. Farmland expanded, cities flourished, trade increased, and with each step forward, the United States proclaimed itself a land of liberty, while carrying within it the contradictions of inequality. The Constitution gave birth to a nation, but it also planted seeds of conflict, seeds that would erupt in struggle, in resistance, and in demands for the promises of freedom to finally be kept. From the very birth of the nation, slavery stood as its greatest contradiction. While leaders spoke of liberty, millions of African men, women, and children lived in chains. Torn from their homelands, sold as property, they built the wealth of America with their blood and labor. Cotton fields, tobacco plantations, railroads, and cities all rose on the backs of the enslaved. Yet within that suffering was resistance. Enslaved people fought back in every way they could, through rebellions, escapes, songs of survival, and the quiet defiance of keeping their culture alive. Each act was a declaration: we are human, and we will not be broken. But slavery was not only a Southern institution, it was a national one. Northern banks financed it. Northern factories thrived on slave-grown cotton. The entire nation was complicit. Still, the divide grew sharper. The South defended slavery as its way of life. The North, pressured by abolitionists and free black voices, began to demand change. The conflict exploded in 1861, the Civil War. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. For 4 long years, the nation tore itself apart. Battles raged across fields and forests, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the enslaved free in the rebelling states. It was a turning point, not just a war for union, but a war for freedom. Enslaved men joined the Union Army, fighting not only to save a nation, but to liberate themselves and their families. At last, in 1865, the Confederacy fell. Slavery was abolished, the chains were broken, but freedom did not mean equality. The scars of slavery would remain, etched into the soul of America. The Civil War ended one chapter of bondage, but it opened another, a struggle that would continue for generations, the fight to turn freedom into reality. The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but a new kind of revolution was already underway. Across the United States, factories rose, railroads stretched across the continent, and machines transformed the pace of life. This was the age of industrialization, a time of invention, ambition, and enormous wealth. But wealth was not shared equally. At the top stood powerful figures, the so-called captains of industry, men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. They built empires of steel, oil, and railroads, amassing fortunes never before seen. They were praised as visionaries, but to many they were robber barons, profiting from the suffering of the masses. For workers, life was harsh. 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Children toiled in factories, women worked for pennies, and men labored until their bodies broke. Accidents were common, safety rare, and poverty widespread. The promise of America's progress was built on the exhaustion of its workers. But from this suffering, a new force began to rise: the labor movement. Workers organized, striking for better pay, shorter hours, and dignity. From the mines of Pennsylvania to the textile mills of Massachusetts, voices of resistance echoed. They demanded not charity, but justice. Yet those in power struck back with violence. Strikers were beaten, arrested, even killed. The state often sided with the wealthy, sending troops to crush protests. Still, the workers kept fighting, their determination unbroken. Industrialization had transformed America into a global power. But beneath the glitter of progress lay inequality, unrest, and the cries of millions who demanded a fair share of the nation they were helping to build. This was not only the rise of industry, it was the rise of a new question: who truly owns the promise of America, the few or the many? As the 19th century ended, America looked beyond its borders. The hunger for land, power, and influence did not stop at the nation's shores. Leaders spoke of destiny, of spreading freedom and civilization, but beneath the noble words lay a familiar truth: conquest and control. In 1898, the Spanish-American War marked a turning point. In just a few months, the United States seized control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was declared liberated, but in reality it was placed under American dominance. The age of U.S. imperialism had begun. For the people in these lands, American arrival was not freedom, it was occupation. In the Philippines, resistance erupted, leading to a brutal war in which hundreds of thousands died. Once again, America justified violence with promises of progress, even as it crushed the independence of others. At the same time, the U.S. expanded its reach in Latin America, intervening in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. The message was clear: American business, American interests, and American power came first. Then came World War I. The nation entered the conflict in 1917, proclaiming it was to make the world safe for democracy. Yet at home, democracy was fragile. Dissenters were silenced, immigrants were distrusted, and civil liberties were crushed under the weight of wartime fear. By the early 20th century, America had risen as a global force. Its armies reached across oceans, its businesses dominated markets, its voice grew louder in world affairs. But this power came with a cost: lives lost abroad, freedoms restricted at home, and a growing divide between the dream of democracy and the reality of empire. The flag of America now flew in distant lands, but the question remained: was it a banner of liberty or a symbol of domination? The Roaring Twenties had promised prosperity. Jazz filled the air, cities gleamed with electric lights, and the stock market seemed unstoppable. But beneath the shine, inequality ran deep. Farmers struggled, workers lived paycheck to paycheck, and wealth was concentrated in the hands of the few. Then, in 1929, it all collapsed. The stock market crashed, and with it, the illusion of endless growth. Banks failed, businesses shut down, families lost their homes, bread lines stretched across city streets. Farmers watched their crops rot in the fields while millions went hungry. Unemployment soared to unimaginable levels. This was the Great Depression, the darkest economic crisis in American history. But out of despair came demand for change. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, promising a New Deal for the American people. His administration launched programs to put people back to work, to provide security, and to restore hope. Roads, bridges, schools, and dams were built by the hands of the unemployed. Social Security was created, offering protection for the elderly and vulnerable. For the first time, the government took responsibility not just for protecting wealth, but for protecting people. The New Deal did not end the Depression entirely, but it gave millions a sense of dignity, a belief that they had not been abandoned. Yet it was not without limits. Many programs excluded Black Americans, women, and the poorest of the poor. Inequality persisted. Still, the New Deal marked a turning point, a recognition that democracy must mean more than survival. It must mean opportunity. Out of the ashes of economic collapse, America learned a lesson that would shape its future, that even in the darkest times, the strength of a nation lies in its people, and the will to rise again. The promise of freedom had been written into America's founding words, but for millions, it remained out of reach. Even after slavery ended, segregation, discrimination, and violence kept Black Americans trapped in second-class citizenship. The mid-20th century brought a new wave of resistance, a demand not for charity, but for justice. From Montgomery to Birmingham, from Selma to Washington, ordinary people rose with extraordinary courage. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Young students faced mobs to enter schools. Marchers crossed bridges knowing they might be beaten, jailed, or killed. Their voices rang out, "We shall overcome." Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence, calling on the nation to live up to its own ideals. Others, like Malcolm X, demanded self-determination and warned that freedom would not come through patience alone. The movement was not one voice, but many, diverse, defiant, and unstoppable. Their struggle brought change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to secure the ballot for all. Barriers that had stood for centuries began to fall. But the fight for justice did not end there. Women demanded equality in the workplace and in society. Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans organized for rights long denied. The LGBTQ+ community rose to demand dignity and recognition. Each movement carried forward the same truth, that democracy is not a gift, but a struggle. These waves of resistance reshaped America. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. They proved that power does not rest only in the hands of the few, but in the voices of the many who refuse to be silent. The civil rights movements showed the world that change is possible, that even against the strongest walls of oppression, people united can break through. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, America stood as the most powerful nation on earth. Its armies stretched across the globe, its economy dominated markets, its culture reached every corner of the world. But with great power came new contradictions. Wars abroad defined generations. From Vietnam to Iraq, from Afghanistan to countless secret interventions, leaders claimed the battles were for freedom, security, and democracy. Yet many questioned, whose freedom? Whose security? For the soldiers who fought, for the civilians caught in the crossfire, and for the families left grieving, the cost was measured in blood, not ideals. At home, new struggles rose. Civil rights were tested again in the fight against racism, inequality, and police violence. Economic divides widened. The wealthy grew richer, while many worked harder for less. Immigrants faced walls and suspicion, even as their labor sustained the nation. But through it all, the people's voice refused to fade. From anti-war protests to the fight for women's rights, from movements for climate justice to marches for Black lives, America's streets became its true battlegrounds. Young and old, rich and poor, stood together to demand a nation that lived up to its promise. Modern America is not just a story of power, it is a story of resistance. A story of ordinary people challenging injustice, of communities uniting to demand change, of voices refusing to be silenced. And so, the history of the United States is not only the history of presidents and wars, it is the history of the people, their struggles, their dreams, their sacrifices. The true story of America is not written by the powerful alone, but by every voice that dared to say, "We are here, we matter, and we will be heard." History is not just about the past, it's about us. It's about the struggles we inherit, the choices we make, and the future we build together. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, carry it forward. And if you'd like to support our work and help us keep bringing powerful stories like this to life, you can do so through our PayPal link in the description. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us continue this journey of knowledge and truth. So don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Join us again as we uncover more stories that shape who we are. Because history is not finished. We are still writing it.